Smoke filled the shattered canopy of the P-47 Thunderbolt as it plummeted toward the French countryside. Through the deafening, choking roar of a dying radial engine, First Lieutenant Tommy Reynolds could only hear one thing: the mocking laughter of his own squadron. For weeks, they had called him paranoid. They had laughed until they cried at the grotesque, heavily modified M1911 pistol strapped to his chest, calling it a rusted abomination of American engineering. But as the ground rushed up to meet him, and a platoon of heavily armed German infantry converged on his crash site, that joke of a weapon was about to become the deadliest thing in the forest. 35 veteran soldiers thought they were hunting a helpless, concussed pilot. They were dead wrong. The damp morning fog of Essex clung to the tarmac of Boxted Airfield in the spring of 1944. Inside the corrugated steel walls of the armory, the smell of Hoppy's numb, 9-gun solvent and stale coffee was thick enough to cut with a combat knife. First Lieutenant Tommy Reynolds stood at a workbench, watching his squadron's chief armorer, Corporal Sullivan Barrett, make the final agonizing adjustments to a weapon that most men on the base considered a crime against ordnance. Tommy was a Thunderbolt pilot, flying the massive, rugged P-47S that escorted American bombers deep into occupied Europe. But while the P-47 was a flying tank, Tommy carried a ghost with him in the cockpit. 6 months prior, his older brother, an infantryman, had been cut down and captured in the sands of North Africa. The letters from the War Department stated his brother had run out of ammunition during a final stand. That singular piece of information had broken something inside Tommy, replacing it with a cold, unrelenting paranoia about being shot down, trapped, and outgunned behind enemy lines. The standard issue survival gear for a downed pilot was a standard M1911 A1 .45 caliber pistol and a couple of 7-round magazines. To Tommy, that was a death sentence. "You're going to blow your own hand off, Tommy," said Captain Richard Conway, leaning against the doorframe of the armory, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. Conway was Tommy's wingman, a textbook ace who trusted his plane and his parachute, and nothing else. "I've seen some dumb things brought into a cockpit, but that takes the cake. It looks like a plumber's nightmare." Tommy ignored him, his eyes glued to Barrett's hands. Resting on the oil-stained canvas was not a standard 1911. It was a mechanical Frankenstein's monster. Barrett, a mechanical savant who had spent his teenage years illegally modifying car engines in Chicago, had taken Tommy's sidearm and completely rebuilt it. To the base of the frame, Barrett had welded a heavy, custom-machined steel foregrip, salvaged and reshaped from a ruined Thompson submachine gun. A crude folding wire stock, scavenged from the guts of a destroyed radio rack, was bolted to the mainspring housing. But the true horror and the source of the squadron's endless mockery lay in the action and the ammunition. Barrett had carefully filed down the sear and disconnected the standard firing mechanism, installing a custom selector switch near the thumb safety. Flipped down, it fired semi-automatic. Flipped up, it turned the handgun into a terrifying, uncontrollable, fully automatic machine pistol, capable of emptying a magazine in less than 2 seconds. To feed this beast, Barrett had cut and welded 3 standard magazines together, creating long, awkward 22-round extended clips that protruded a full 6 inches from the bottom of the grip. Finally, to keep the muzzle from flipping wildly into the sky under the immense recoil of rapid fire. 45 ACP rounds, a makeshift compensator, had been threaded onto the barrel, venting gases upward. "It's not a nightmare, Dick," Tommy finally said, picking up the heavy, unbalanced weapon. The cold steel felt grounding. "It's an insurance policy." Conway scoffed, tossing his cigarette onto the wet tarmac. "It's a joke. You're flying a fighter plane, not storming the beaches at Dieppe. If you have to pull that ugly piece of scrap metal out, you're already surrounded. 30 men with Mausers aren't going to care about your little science project. You'll jam on the 3rd round, and they'll string you up by your parachute silk." "Let them try," Tommy murmured, sliding the weapon into a custom-stitched leather canvas holster that hung awkwardly across his chest. alongside a heavy canvas dump pouch holding 6 of the monstrous extended magazines. The rest of the 56th Fighter Group shared Conway's sentiment. In the mess hall, they called it Tommy's typewriter and the Widowmaker, not because it would kill the enemy, but because they assumed it would explode in his face. Whenever Tommy waddled out to his plane, weighed down by the extra 10 pounds of steel and ammunition, chuckles echoed across the flight line. To the polished, elite fighter pilots of the USAAF, infantry combat was beneath them, and Tommy's obsession with a ground war last stand was viewed as a morbid, embarrassing eccentricity. But Tommy didn't care. Every night while the others drank at the local pub, he went out to the dirt berms behind the firing range. He practiced bracing the wire stock against his shoulder, gripping the forward handle, and managing the violent, bone-rattling recoil of the fully automatic bursts. It kicked like a mule, threatened to jump out of his hands and spit brass casings in a blinding arc. But it worked, and in the tight, terrifying spaces of his imagination, he knew exactly how he intended to use it. May 14th, 1944. The sky above northern France was a brilliant, deceptive blue, violently punctuated by the ugly black smudges of German anti-aircraft fire. The Allied invasion of Europe was weeks away, and the priority for the fighter bombers was absolute disruption. Destroy rail yards, shred supply convoys, and bleed the German war machine dry before the infantry hit the beaches. Tommy sat in the cramped, freezing cockpit of his P-47, nicknamed Iron Resolve, flying at 12,000 feet. Below them, the sprawling railway hub near Rouen lay like a vital artery. Red flight. Target is in sight. Drop down to 3,000. Watch the flak batteries on the ridge, crackled Conway's voice over the radio. Copy that, Red Leader, Tommy replied, his heart hammering a familiar, rhythmic staccato against his ribs. He pushed the stick forward, and the massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared as the Thunderbolt dove toward the earth. The G-force pressed him deep into his seat. Through the plexiglass, the world rushed up in a blur of green fields, gray stone buildings, and the sudden, terrifying flashes of tracer fire reaching up like fiery fingers. They hit the rail yard hard. Tommy depressed the trigger on his stick, and the 8 .50 caliber machine guns in his wings unleashed a hellish torrent of lead. He watched as a German munitions train violently erupted, sending a shockwave that physically rocked his heavy fighter plane. Good hit, Tommy. Pull up, Conway yelled. Tommy hauled back on the stick, the G-forces threatening to pull the blood from his brain. But he had lingered a second too long. A concealed German 88mm anti-aircraft battery, nestled in a cluster of trees near the rail yard, tracked the ascending Thunderbolt. The gunners didn't need a direct hit. They just needed to be close. Crack boom. The explosion detonated just beneath the belly of Iron Resolve. The concussive force slammed Tommy's head against the canopy frame, shattering his goggles. A blinding spray of hot, black oil instantly coated the windshield. Shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin of the fuselage like paper, instantly severing the main hydraulic lines and smashing into the engine block. The mighty radial engine coughed, sputtered, and emitted a horrific metallic shriek before dying completely. Silence, save for the wind, screaming over the airframe, filled the cockpit. I'm hit. Mayday, Red Flight. I've lost the engine, Tommy shouted into his radio, wrestling with the heavy, unresponsive controls. Tommy, bail out. Get out of there. Conway's voice was frantic. Tommy looked at the altimeter. It was unwinding with terrifying speed. 1,000 feet. 800. He was too low. The P-47 was a brick without its engine, and bailing out now would mean his parachute wouldn't have time to fully deploy. He was going to have to ride the heavy beast into the dirt. Too low, Dick. I'm putting her down. Beneath him lay a dense, sprawling apple orchard bordered by thick, ancient stone walls. It was the only clearing. Tommy braced his feet against the rudder pedals, locked his elbows, and waited for the end. The Thunderbolt hit the treetops at 140 miles per hour. Branches thick as a man's torso snapped against the wings, violently spinning the aircraft. The plane slammed into the soft, muddy earth skipping once, twice, before the left wing dug into the ground. The aircraft cartwheeled, a terrifying centrifuge of tearing metal, shattered glass, and screaming dirt. When the violent motion finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute, ringing in Tommy's ears. He was hanging upside down in the harness. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel was overwhelming, pooling in the shattered cockpit. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his concussion. Fire. With trembling, blood-slicked hands, Tommy released the harness. He fell onto the shattered canopy glass. Kicking wildly, he forced his way out of a jagged hole in the fuselage, tumbling into the wet French mud, just as a spark ignited the fuel lines. Whoosh! The thunderbolt erupted into a brilliant, towering fireball. Tommy crawled backward, gasping for air, clutching his ribs. He was alive, battered, bruised, bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead, but no bones felt broken. Then, over the crackling of the burning wreckage, he heard it. Dogs. The frantic, aggressive barking of German shepherds, followed closely by the harsh, guttural shouts of men moving rapidly through the brush. They had seen the plane go down. They were close, very close. Tommy frantically patted his chest. His fingers brushed the cold, hard steel of the modified M1911 in its chest rig. The heavy canvas pouch of extended magazines bumped against his hip. Conway's mocking words echoed in his ringing ears. 30 men with Mausers aren't going to care about your little science project. Tommy pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. He drew the heavy, unbalanced pistol. He flipped out the wire stock, locking it into place with a sharp click, and racked the heavy slide, chambering a fat, .45 caliber hollow point round. He didn't run away from the tree line. He backed slowly into the densest part of the orchard, moving toward a partially collapsed stone farming wall. He was alone. He was hunted. And the joke was over. Oberfeld-Webel Dieter Kraus was a man who did not believe in taking chances, nor did he believe in taking prisoners when the situation was inconvenient. A scarred veteran of the Eastern Front, Kraus commanded a heavy patrol of 35 seasoned German infantrymen. They had been stationed near the rail yard, specifically to hunt down Allied airmen and saboteurs. When the American fighter went down in the orchard, barely a mile from their position, Kraus moved his men with ruthless efficiency. They formed a wide crescent, sweeping through the trees, submachine guns, and Kar-9 8K rifles at the ready. "Find him quickly," Kraus barked, his voice carrying through the damp trees. "He is either dead, or he is broken. Spread out. Do not let him slip into the ravine." Tommy heard the commands clearly. He was crouched behind the ruined stone wall, the rough moss pressing into his back. The wall was perhaps waist-high, remnants of an old sheep pen, offering just enough cover to conceal his prone form. He unclipped the pouch on his hip, pulling out 3 of the massive 22-round magazines and laying them carefully on a flat stone next to him. His breathing was ragged. Fear, cold and paralyzing, threatened to lock his muscles. He closed his eyes, visualizing his brother in the sands of Africa. "Not today. I am not walking into a cage." He peeked through a missing chink in the stone wall. Through the morning mist and the smoke of his burning plane, he saw the gray uniforms. They were moving tactically, bounding from tree to tree. 5 men, then 10, then 20. They were fanning out, encircling the wreckage of the Thunderbolt. A young German soldier, barely out of his teens, holding an MP-40 submachine gun, broke away from the main group. He was tracking a smear of blood Tommy had left on a fern. The boy was walking directly toward the stone wall. 30 yards. 20 yards. Tommy pressed the wire stock tightly against his right shoulder. He grabbed the Thompson foregrip with his left hand, his knuckles turning white. His thumb hovered over Barrett's custom selector switch. He clicked it upward. Full auto. 15 yards. The young soldier paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at the gap in the stone wall. He raised his MP-40, opening his mouth to shout a warning to the rest of the platoon. Tommy stood up, resting his elbows on the stone wall. He pulled the trigger. The modified M1911 didn't just fire. it erupted. The gun roared with a deafening mechanical chatter that sounded completely alien in the French forest, faster than a standard submachine gun, deeper and more concussive than a typical pistol. The makeshift compensator violently vented hot gas, blowing dead leaves into the air. Brrr. In less than a second and a half, 10 heavy, .45 caliber rounds tore through the air. The recoil was monstrous, trying to buck the muzzle upward, but Tommy's grip on the heavy forward handle and his braced shoulder held the weapon level. The young German soldier never had a chance to scream. The sheer kinetic force of the burst lifted him off his feet, throwing him backward into the dirt. The forest exploded into chaos. The remaining 34 Germans instantly hit the ground, screaming in confusion. "Contact! Contact right!" Kraus bellowed, diving behind a thick oak tree. "Machine gun! Heavy machine gun!" Kraus's mind raced. The rate of fire and the booming report didn't sound like a downed pilot with a service pistol. It sounded like an American Thompson, but firing at a terrifying cyclic rate. Kraus instantly assumed they had walked into an ambush. He assumed the pilot had survived and managed to link up with a squad of French resistance fighters, or worse, advance Allied paratroopers. "Suppressing fire! Flatten that wall!" Kraus ordered. Instantly, the tree line lit up. Dozens of rifles and 2 MG-34 machine guns opened up, sending a hailstorm of lead tearing through the orchard. Bullets shattered the top of Tommy's stone wall, showering him in sharp rock chips and dust. Tommy ducked low, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The magazine was half empty. He had just fired a burst that would have melted a standard handgun barrel. The chamber was smoking furiously, the smell of burnt gunpowder searing his nostrils. He scrambled 10 feet to his left, crawling through the mud, staying below the wall line. He popped up at a new angle. Through the smoke, he saw 3 German soldiers attempting to flank him on the right, rushing across an open patch of grass. Tommy aimed and squeezed the trigger, holding it down for a full second. Brar! 12 rounds emptied from the magazine, spitting a stream of heavy brass casings into the dirt. The 3 flanking Germans were caught dead in the open. The heavy, .45 rounds, designed to stop a man in his tracks, did their grim work. 2 of the soldiers went down instantly, screaming, clutching their legs and chests. The third scrambled wildly back behind a tree, dropping his rifle in panic. The slide of the 1911 locked back with a sharp metallic clack, empty. Tommy dropped the spent, elongated magazine into the mud, snatched one of the full .22 rounders from the rock, slammed it home, and racked the slide. Less than 3 seconds, the hours of muscle memory behind the armory dirt berms had taken over. On the German side, the confusion was mounting into terror. "How many are there?" shouted a panicking soldier near Kraus, pressing his face into the dirt as heavy rounds chewed the bark off the tree above him. "It sounds like a whole squad with submachine guns," another yelled. "They are tearing us apart." Kraus ground his teeth. This was impossible. The intelligence report said it was a single fighter plane, but the volume of fire pouring from that stone wall was devastating. The weapon sounded like it was ripping the very air in half. "Hold the line! Throw grenades!" Kraus ordered, pulling a stick grenade from his belt. Tommy saw the arc of the explosive sailing through the air. It landed with a soft thud 5 feet away, on his side of the wall. "Damn it!" Tommy hissed. He abandoned the wall, scrambling backward like a crab, diving into a shallow drainage ditch just as the grenade detonated. The explosion threw dirt and deafening noise over him, ringing his ears and blurring his vision. The Germans were advancing. He could hear their boots splashing in the mud. He had lost his cover. He was down to 4 magazines. The weapon in his hands was burning hot through his leather flight gloves. He had to move, or he was going to die right here in the mud. Looking over his shoulder, Tommy spotted his only hope. About 60 yards behind him, across a deadly open space, stood the remains of a heavy stone farmhouse. If he could make it there, he could force them into a choke point. But to get there, he would have to run through a wall of German bullets. Tommy gripped the customized 1000 M1911, the weapon the 56th Fighter Group had called a punchline. He took a deep breath of smoke-filled air, checked the selector switch was still set to full auto, and prepared to do something entirely insane. The shallow drainage ditch offered nothing but a temporary reprieve. Mud seeped through Tommy's leather flight jacket, cold and heavy, as the deafening crack of Mauser rifles splintered the trees just inches above his head. Oberfeldwebel Kraus was barking orders, his voice cutting through the thick gray smoke of the burning thunderbolt. The Germans were executing a classic pincer movement, attempting to flank the ditch from both the left and right. Tommy glanced at the ruined stone farmhouse 60 yards away. 60 yards of ankle-high grass, exposed roots, and zero cover. It was a suicide run. But staying in the ditch meant waiting for a potato masher grenade to land in his lap. He looked down at the monstrosity in his hands. The heavy steel barrel of the modified M1911 was already radiating a blistering heat. The custom 22-round magazine protruded awkwardly, coated in a fine layer of French mud. He wiped the ejection port clean with his thumb. "All right, Barrett," Tommy whispered to himself, thinking of the eccentric armorer back in Essex. "Let's see if your weld holds." He pulled his legs under him, coiling his muscles like a loaded spring. He didn't just need to run, he needed to create his own suppressing fire. In standard infantry tactics, you needed a 3-man team with a Browning automatic rifle to properly suppress a tree line. Tommy only had one hand, and a weapon the entire 56th Fighter Group had treated as a punchline. Tommy erupted from the ditch. He didn't sprint in a straight line. He broke into a frantic, zigzagging dash, keeping his center of gravity low. The moment his boots hit the open grass, the German line erupted. Dirt geysers kicked up around his ankles as 7.92mm rounds snapped past him like angry hornets. He tucked the wire stock tightly under his right armpit, gripped the Thompson foregrip with his left, and pointed the weapon toward the heaviest concentration of muzzle flashes on his right flank. Brrr. He held the trigger down for a solid, terrifying 2 seconds. The gun bucked wildly, fighting to climb into the sky, but the makeshift compensator and Tommy's desperate grip kept it relatively level. 15 heavy, .45 caliber slugs tore into the brush at 800 rounds per minute. It was a wall of lead. Gefreiter Lucas Weber, a young German rifleman attempting to flank the ditch, suddenly found the trunk of the birch tree he was using for cover disintegrating. Bark and wood splinters exploded into his face. He dropped his rifle and threw his hands over his eyes, screaming. The sheer volume of fire was incomprehensible. The terrifying mechanical roar of the weapon sounded like an MG-42, but deeper, chunkier. "Get down! They are breaking out!" Weber shrieked, entirely convinced a squad of American paratroopers was charging their position. The German fire momentarily slackened as half the platoon dove into the mud, instinctively reacting to the overwhelming noise and the heavy rounds chewing the foliage to pieces. That hesitation bought Tommy exactly 3 seconds. He was halfway to the farmhouse. His lungs burned. The magazine clicked empty. Tommy hit the magazine release on the run. The empty steel box dropped into the grass. He snatched his third 22-round magazine from his dump pouch and slammed it upward into the grip. Click. Jam. The bolt stopped halfway forward. A stovepipe. A brass casing, deformed by the violent extraction process, was caught horizontally in the ejection port. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked in Tommy's chest. The weapon was a prototype, a Frankenstein build, and it had finally choked. He was 30 yards from the house, completely exposed. Slap, rack, clear. The armory drills took over. Without breaking stride, Tommy violently swept his left hand over the top of the slide, knocking the mangled brass casing free, and let the slide slam home, chambering a fresh round. Kraus, however, had realized the deception. Peering through his binoculars from behind a thick oak, he saw a lone man in a leather bomber jacket sprinting across the field. No squad, no heavy machine gun, just one pilot wielding a bizarre, oversized pistol. "It is only one man. Shoot him now," Kraus bellowed, his face twisting in fury at the humiliation. MG-34, open fire. The distinct, terrifying reeing up of the German machine gun tore through the clearing. Tracers lashed out, a lethal whip of red light. Tommy felt a violent searing tug on his right calf, as if someone had swung a hot iron bar into his leg. The grazing hit spun him around. He stumbled, falling hard onto his left shoulder, sliding across the damp grass. He bit down on his lip to keep from screaming, tasting blood. He was 10 yards from the farmhouse door. Rolling onto his back, Tommy aimed the 1911 at the MG-34's muzzle flash in the distance. He squeezed the trigger. Brrr. 7 rounds spat from the barrel. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about the concussive fear of heavy 45 rounds snapping through the air. The bullets smashed into the rocks surrounding the German machine gunner, showering the crew in deadly shrapnel. The MG-34 momentarily ceased fire as the gunner ducked. Using his good leg, Tommy scrambled backward, kicking off the dirt until his back slammed against the rotting wooden steps of the farmhouse. He reached up, grabbed the rusty iron handle of the heavy oak door, and threw himself inside, collapsing onto the dusty floorboards. As half a dozen Mauser rounds splintered the wood where his head had just been. He was inside, but he was trapped. The interior of the farmhouse was suffocatingly dark, smelling of mildew, dry rot, and old hay. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, piercing through the bullet holes in the walls. Tommy dragged himself away from the door, leaving a streak of dark blood on the floorboards from his wounded calf. He propped himself up against a heavy stone fireplace in the center of the main room, gasping for air. He stripped off his leather flight gloves. His left palm was blistered. The intense heat from the rapid-fire bursts had transferred straight through the steel foregrip and the makeshift weld. The weapon was functioning, but it was physically cooking itself. He did a frantic inventory. He ejected the current magazine. It felt light. He had maybe 8 rounds left in it. He dropped it back into his pouch and pulled out his last 2 fully loaded 22-round magazines. 44 rounds, plus the 8 in the partial magazine. 52 bullets left between him and a German prisoner of war camp. Outside, he could hear the distinct crunch of combat boots encircling the property. 35 men, minus the 3 he had hit in the orchard, were drawing a tightening noose around the stone walls. "Hold your fire," came Krause's voice, echoing eerily through the shattered windows. "American pilot, you are surrounded by a full platoon of the Wehrmacht. Your aircraft is destroyed. Throw your weapon out of the window and surrender, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Tommy let out a dry, humorless laugh. He ripped a strip of fabric from his silk scarf and tied a tight, makeshift tourniquet over his bleeding calf. Surrender wasn't an option. His brother's last letter, stained with desert sand, flashed in his mind. "They don't stop until you're empty, Tommy. Don't ever go empty." Tommy reached down and grabbed the custom selector switch Barrett had installed. With a firm push, he clicked it downward. Semi-automatic. If he sprayed the rest of his ammunition now, he would be dead in 2 minutes. He had to prove he was just as deadly with precision as he was with volume. He crawled toward a shattered side window, keeping his head well below the sill. Peeking through a crack in the shutter, he saw the tactical error Krause was making. Assuming the pilot was armed with an uncontrollable submachine gun, Krause was sending a 2-man scout team to quietly breach the rear kitchen door, believing the American wouldn't be able to hit a moving target with precision at 50 yards. Tommy rested the heavy barrel of the 1911 on the stone windowsill. The wire stock dug into his shoulder. The weapon, though heavy and unbalanced, was built on a national match frame. Underneath the welds in the extended magazines, it was still a superbly accurate piece of ordnance. He lined up the iron sights on the lead scout, who was creeping along a dilapidated wooden fence line. Crack. The single shot rang out, sharp and distinct. The heavy .45 hollow point caught the scout squarely in the chest, dropping him instantly without a sound. The second scout froze, bewildered by the single, precise shot. Before he could raise his rifle, Tommy adjusted his aim and squeezed the trigger again. Crack. The second soldier took a round to the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the fence, screaming for a medic. Outside, the psychology of the battlefield shifted violently. Krauss cursed in German. The weapon wasn't just an uncontrollable spray-and-pray abomination. It was a marksman's tool when it needed to be. The American pilot had pinned them down with the fire rate of a heavy machine gun and was now picking them off with the precision of a sniper. Fear began to ripple through the German ranks. They were 30 men, fighting a ghost who wielded a weapon that defied logic. "Assault the front!" Krauss finally roared, losing his patience. "Smoke the door and breach it. Now." Two distinct pop sounds echoed outside, and seconds later, thick gray smoke began to billow through the cracks in the heavy oak front door. They were going to rush the choke point. Tommy abandoned the window. He dragged himself into the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the front room. It was a fatal funnel, only 4 feet wide. He wedged himself behind a heavy, overturned oak dining table, bracing the wire stock against his right shoulder. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg, and clicked the selector switch back up. Full auto. He slid his last, fully loaded 22-round magazine into the grip. The heavy click echoed in the silent, smoky room. Crash. The front door splintered inward as a heavy combat boot kicked it off its rusty hinges. The smoke rolled into the hallway like a gray tide. Through the haze, Tommy saw the silhouettes of 4 German assault troops, submachine guns raised, charging into the narrow corridor. They expected a panicked man with an empty pistol. What they got was Tommy's typewriter. Tommy depressed the trigger and held it down. The hallway turned into a blinding, deafening tunnel of muzzle flashes and roaring thunder. The noise in the enclosed space was physically painful, blowing dust from the ceiling beams. Brrr! 22 rounds emptied in roughly 2 seconds. In the narrow, 4-foot-wide hallway, the heavy, 45 slugs acted like a scythe. The wooden doorframe practically disintegrated into toothpicks. The lead German soldier was hit multiple times, his body acting as a grisly shield for the men behind him, but the sheer kinetic energy of the hollow points tore through, catching the second and third men in a devastating cross-spray. Screams of pure agony and terror mixed with the deafening metallic clack of the 1911 slide locking back. The assault element was completely shattered. The surviving man scrambled backward out the door, abandoning his weapon in the dirt, screaming that the house was filled with Americans. Tommy sat in the sudden, ringing silence of the hallway. The gun in his hand was smoking violently, the barrel glowing with a dull, terrifying heat. The smell of copper, blood, and burnt cordite was suffocating. He hit the magazine release, dropping the empty clip, and shoved his final, partially loaded magazine into the well. 8 rounds left. Outside, Krauss stared at the smoking doorway of the farmhouse, his face pale. 7 of his men were dead or incapacitated. He had a heavily armed platoon, and they were being systematically butchered by a single, downed aviator. "Bring up the Panzerschreck," Krauss said quietly, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Blow the entire front of the building into the cellar. I want nothing left but dust." Inside, Tommy pressed his back against the wall, listening to the heavy boots repositioning outside. He checked the chamber, 1 in the pipe, 7 in the magazine. He closed his eyes, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He had survived the crash, the open field, and the breach. But as he heard the distinct heavy clanking of an anti-tank weapon being assembled outside, he knew the real miracle wasn't surviving. It was the fact that a joke from the Essex Armory had brought the mighty German war machine to a bloody, grinding halt. The distinctive metallic scraping of a Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket being loaded into its steel tube was a sound that carried a universal translation: absolute destruction. First Lieutenant Tommy Reynolds knew the farmhouse's thick stone walls could stop 7.9 2mm rifle fire all day, but they would crumble like dry biscuits under the shape-charged warhead of a rocket designed to gut Sherman tanks. "Klein! Backblast clear!" Krauss's voice barked from the tree line, muffled slightly by the ringing in Tommy's ears. Tommy didn't hesitate. He pushed off the floorboards, his wounded right calf screaming in protest, and desperately scanned the shadowy, smoke-filled room. A standard infantryman might have frozen, but a fighter pilot's brain was wired to process three-dimensional space and emergency exits in fractions of a second. Beneath a tattered, mold-spotted rug near the kitchen threshold, his boots caught on an uneven iron ring, a root cellar. He threw the rug aside, grabbed the iron ring, and heaved. The heavy wooden trapdoor groaned open, revealing a pitch-black, narrow stone staircase descending into the cold earth. Fire! Kraus roared outside. The characteristic whoosh hiss of the rocket motor, igniting, tore through the air. Tommy threw himself headfirst down the stairs, not even bothering to close the trap door, tucking his body into a tight ball as he cascaded down the rough-hewn stone steps. The explosion was apocalyptic. The Panzerschreck rocket detonated against the main structural column between the front door and the window. The blast wave didn't just break the wall. It instantly atomized the stone, turning century-old masonry into lethal, high-velocity shrapnel. The entire roof of the farmhouse groaned, the heavy oak beams snapping like dried twigs before collapsing inward. A blinding flash of orange light illuminated the cellar for a millisecond before a crushing wave of pressure, dust, and debris blew down the stairwell. Tommy slammed into the packed dirt floor of the cellar, the wind violently knocked from his lungs. Plaster, shattered wood, and stones rained down through the open trapdoor, burying his legs and lower torso. The noise was so absolute that it pushed past deafening into a strange, localized silence. For a long minute, he lay there in the suffocating darkness, tasting pulverized mortar and copper. He coughed, a wet, agonizing hack that sent spikes of pain through his bruised ribs. He wiggled his toes. His boots were buried under 50 pounds of rubble, but his legs still worked. He used his left hand to wipe a thick layer of dust from his eyes. In his right hand, gripped so tightly his knuckles were completely bloodless, was the modified M1911. Above him, the dust began to settle. The midday sun streamed through the collapsed floorboards, casting jagged, ethereal shafts of light into the cellar. And then he heard the sound that chilled his blood, the crunching of boots on shattered stone. "Spread out! Check the rubble," Kraus commanded, his voice unnervingly close. He was standing right in what used to be the living room. "If he is alive, put a bullet in his head. I want this finished. We have wasted too much time and too many men." Tommy painfully dragged his legs free from the fallen stones. He lay on his back, aiming the heavy steel barrel of the pistol straight up at the ragged opening of the trapdoor. The selector switch was still set to full auto, but he only had 8 rounds left in the extended magazine. 8 rounds against 20-odd surviving, heavily armed German veterans. He needed them to bunch up. He needed them to think they had won. "Oberfeldwebel," a voice called out from directly above the trapdoor. A silhouette blocked out the sunlight. It was a German infantryman peering down into the dusty gloom. "There is a cellar down here. The trapdoor is open. Throw a grenade down," Kraus ordered flatly, stepping into view beside the soldier. "Do not go down there." Tommy's heart hammered against his sternum. He had less than 2 seconds before a stick grenade dropped into the confined space, turning the cellar into a meat grinder. He didn't have the luxury of aiming. He just had the angle. He braced the wire stock against his collarbone, aimed upward through the dust motes, and pulled the trigger. Brrrr. The final 8 rounds of the monstrous weapon emptied in a blinding, concussive flash that illuminated the dark cellar like a strobe light. The heavy, .45 caliber slugs ripped upward through the opening. The sheer violence of the burst at point-blank range was devastating. The soldier holding the grenade was practically lifted off his feet, his chest pulverized by 3 massive hollow points, dropping the unpinned explosive onto the floorboards above the cellar. Kraus, standing just inches away, took a grazing round to his bicep that spun him around, throwing him backward into the rubble of the collapsed chimney. "Grenade! Drop!" Kraus screamed in terror, realizing the dead man had dropped the live explosive in their own perimeter. Boom! The blast rocked the floorboards above, sending another shower of dust and splinters down on Tommy. Screams echoed from the ground floor as the shrapnel tore through the tight grouping of German soldiers who had gathered to inspect the ruins. The slide of the 1911 locked back. It was completely empty. The barrel was smoking, scorched, and the makeshift compensator was slightly warped from the sheer volume of heat it had endured over the last 20 minutes. Tommy unclipped the empty magazine, let it fall to the dirt, and shoved the empty, smoking weapon back into his chest holster. He was out of ammunition. He had fought a heavily armed platoon to a standstill with a handgun, but the magic trick was over. He pulled his standard-issue survival combat knife from his boot, gripping the leather handle. If they came down the stairs, he would make them bleed for every inch. But as he waited in the dust, preparing for the final rush, a new sound began to vibrate through the earth. It wasn't the sound of boots. It was a deep, resonant hum that quickly built into a bone-rattling roar. It was a sound Tommy knew better than his own heartbeat. Two massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double-wasp radial engines were tearing through the sky at 300 miles per hour. The suffocating darkness of the root cellar was heavy with the taste of pulverized mortar, copper blood, and the acrid stench of burnt cordite. First Lieutenant Tommy Reynolds lay on his back against the damp earth, his chest heaving painfully against his bruised ribs. He stared up at the jagged square of pale light where the trapdoor used to be. The dust raining down from the shattered floorboards coated his face like a death mask. His right hand, completely numb from the blistering heat of the extended firefights, slowly released the grip of his customized M1911. The weapon was dead. The slide was locked back on an empty chamber, the heavy barrel warped and discolored by a volume of fire it was never engineered to withstand. Tommy shoved the useless, smoking iron into his leather chest holster and drew the standard-issue combat knife from his boot. The blade caught a single beam of dusty sunlight. It was a pathetic final defense against a platoon of angry, humiliated veteran infantrymen, but he gripped the leather handle until his knuckles turned bone white. He would not be pulled from this hole alive. Above him, the horrific aftermath of his final point-blank burst was playing out in the ruins of the farmhouse. The explosion of the dropped stick grenade had momentarily stunned the German assault, but the paralysis was fading. Through the ringing in his ears, Tommy could hear the agonizing groans of the dying and the frantic, enraged screaming of Oberfeldwebel-Dieter Kraus. "Get up! Do not lie there bleeding! Get to your feet!" Kraus roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of pain and manic desperation. The veteran commander had taken a grazing round to the bicep from Tommy's final barrage, and the psychological toll of losing over a dozen men to a single downed pilot had shattered his tactical composure. "He is out of ammunition. I heard the slide lock. Surround the hole. Bring the MG-34 up to the edge, and fire until the barrel melts. I want him reduced to scraps." Tommy pressed his spine against the cold dirt wall of the cellar, pulling his bleeding right leg beneath him, coiling his muscles for the moment the first gray uniform blocked the light of the trapdoor. He could hear the heavy crunch of boots on the splintered floorboards, advancing cautiously. They were 20 feet away, then 10. The metallic clatter of the heavy machine gun's bipod legs deploying echoed directly above him. Then the vibration began. It did not start as a sound, but as a deep, rhythmic trembling in the packed earth beneath Tommy's boots. The loose pebbles on the cellar floor began to dance. The dust hanging in the air suddenly swirled in violent, agitated circles. High above the French tree line, tearing through the thin, wispy clouds at an altitude of barely 2,000 feet, Captain Richard Conway had not abandoned his wingman. After witnessing the catastrophic explosion of the Panzerschreck warhead that had leveled the farmhouse, Conway had broken radio silence and flatly refused the flight leader's order to return to Boxted Airfield. Instead, he had thrown his massive 7-ton P-47 Thunderbolt into a screaming vertical dive, burning his reserve fuel to get back to the crash site. "I have visual on the smoke, holding attack vector." Conway's voice was a cold, sharp blade over the radio as he armed his weapon systems. Through his armored windshield, The ruined farmhouse looked like a crushed matchbox, surrounded by the tiny gray specks of German infantry. Conway pushed the throttle completely to the firewall. The mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double-wasp radial engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, howled like a mechanical leviathan. He didn't just fly toward the target, he plummeted toward it, the airframe shuddering violently as he approached 350 miles per hour. In the ruins above the cellar, Krauss froze. He recognized that sound. It was the apocalyptic shriek of heavy aviation descending directly upon them. He looked up, his blood running entirely cold. Just as the massive silhouette of the Thunderbolt cleared the tops of the oak trees, its wings casting a terrifying, momentary shadow over the pulverized farmhouse. "Aviation!" Krauss shrieked, his voice entirely lost beneath the engine's roar. "Scatter! Into the woods!" It was far too late. Conway gripped the stick and squeezed the heavy trigger. The 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in the Thunderbolt's wings, erupted simultaneously. Firing a combined total of over 6,000 rounds per minute, the aircraft unleashed a cataclysmic wall of armor-piercing incendiary lead. The earth simply exploded. A devastating line of dirt geysers, shattered stone, and torn wood marched instantly across the clearing, tracking directly through the center of the German perimeter. The noise was incomprehensible, a continuous, deafening roar of ripping canvas that drowned out the world. The heavy, half-inch slugs didn't just hit the remaining German soldiers. They tore through them, completely ignoring the cover of the stone walls and thick tree trunks. The MG-34 crew that had been setting up over Tommy's trapdoor was instantly vaporized in a direct strafing run. The heavy weapon itself shattered into flying shrapnel. Trees thick enough to stop a tank shell were violently severed in half by the sheer volume of incoming fire, collapsing into the muddy orchard. Inside the cellar, Tommy threw his arms over his head and pressed his face directly into the dirt. The ground bucked beneath him, as if struck by a massive earthquake. The noise was absolute physical agony, pressing against his eardrums until he thought his skull would crack. The entire ceiling of the cellar threatened to cave in as the .50 caliber rounds chewed the remaining surface structures into a fine, blinding powder. For 5 terrifying seconds, the world was nothing but fire, dust, and roaring thunder. Then, the Thunderbolt pulled up in a steep, aggressive climb, the engine note shifting to a deep, resonant hum as it clawed its way back into the sky to circle for another pass. Tommy lay paralyzed in the suffocating darkness. The deafening roar of the machine guns was replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. There were no shouts of command from Krauss. There were no frantic footsteps of surviving soldiers. There was only the gentle crackle of burning timber and the soft thud of falling debris. With agonizing slowness, his muscles screaming in protest, Tommy sheathed his combat knife. He wiped the thick layer of plaster and blood from his eyes. Grabbing the jagged, splintered edge of the trapdoor opening, he hauled his battered body upward, pulling himself out of the underground tomb. He collapsed onto his stomach on what remained of the ground floor. The scene before him defied belief. The farmhouse was gone. The orchard was a mangled, smoking wasteland of shredded wood, cratered mud, and complete silence. The elite, heavily armed German platoon that had hunted him with such arrogant precision had simply ceased to exist, erased by the overwhelming industrial fury of American air power. Tommy rolled onto his back, gasping down huge lungfuls of the cool, smoky French air. High above, the silver silhouette of Conway's P-47 banked sharply, dipping its massive wings left and right in a clear, triumphant salute before turning its nose toward the English Channel. Slowly, Tommy sat up. He reached into his leather rig and pulled out the ruined, blackened M1911. He ran his thumb over the bent wire stock and the warped, custom-welded foregrip. His squadron had called it a paranoid joke. They had laughed at the impossible extended magazines and the reckless rate of fire. But as Tommy looked around the smoking ruins of the battlefield, holding the heavy, empty piece of steel that had kept him alive against 35 men, he knew he would never fly without it again. Using a piece of shattered doorframe as a crutch, Tommy Reynolds pushed himself to his feet and began the long, quiet walk into the western tree line. 3 weeks later, First Lieutenant Tommy Reynolds limped into the armory at Boxted Airfield, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The room fell entirely silent. The mocking laughter that used to follow him was gone, replaced by a reverent, almost superstitious awe. The story of the downed pilot who held off an entire elite German infantry platoon with a plumber's nightmare had spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Tommy walked over to the workbench where Corporal Sullivan Barrett was cleaning a standard-issue rifle. Tommy unbuckled his leather chest rig and laid the scorched, warped, custom-modified machine pistol onto the oil-stained canvas. It was a mechanical monstrosity that defied conventional military doctrine, a precursor to the specialized machine pistols that would later be experimented with by special forces, proving that devastating, close-quarters volume of fire could break an enemy's psychological will to fight. It jammed once. "Sully," Tommy said quietly, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "On the third magazine, you might want to look at the extractor." Barrett stared at the battle-scarred weapon, then looked up at Tommy, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound pride. "Yes, sir," the armorer whispered. "I'll get right on that."